Hi there, and welcome to a brand new lesson from SixSq Classroom. We are now building on top of the previous lesson, where we have learned how to create credentials in Nuvla.io. So if you remember, credentials are a type of sensitive resource in Nuvla that will give your user account access to the Nuvla to different types of resources. One of those resources, and probably one of the most important ones that you'll have to learn, are infrastructure services. If you remember Nuvla's architecture, Nuvla is capable of managing and speaking with infrastructures both at the cloud and edge level. So we need to learn how to import infrastructures, and then we will create credentials to access those infrastructures. Okay? So first things first, we go on the left side here and we click on the infrastructures button here, and as you can see, we have an empty page. We have nothing yet, of course. So what we want to do in this lesson is to import an existing infrastructure. We will do this for both a Docker infrastructure and a Kubernetes infrastructure. Okay, I have it here on my right side. I have a Docker machine here, which is already set up. It's running in a cloud, has a public IP, and we will also import from here a Kubernetes cluster on the same machine. We'll do this later. For now, on the left side, click on Add, and you can see here we have multiple types of infrastructures. The ones for today's lesson are the two on top. We are going to import an existing Docker Swarm infrastructure and afterwards a Kubernetes cluster infrastructure. Okay? I keep putting some emphasis on the word importing because we can also create new infrastructures from Nuvla.io. But we will do this on the next lesson. Okay? So for today, we are assuming that you already have an infrastructure somewhere and you just want to import it into Nuvla.io. So let's start with a Docker Swarm. And as you can see here, you have a form which is split into sections. On top, these are the minimum requirements that you need to import an existing Swarm cluster. And on the bottom, this will be the subject of the next lesson, are the attributes and properties that you need to provide to ask Nuvla.io to create a new cluster for you in some cloud service provider. Okay, we'll leave this for the next lesson. So for now, we want to import. So let's give it a name, imported Docker Swarm, and my imported Docker Swarm infrastructure service during SixSq Classroom, right? And we need to provide an endpoint. This is the endpoint for the Docker API that Nuvla.io will use to reach out to your infrastructure, okay? So we go here on the right side. As I said, I already have a Docker machine set up here. And if we do hostname -I can take my public IP. It needs to be an endpoint where Nuvla.io can reach. So either an IP under SixSq's VPN server or a public IP. So in this case, I have a public IP. I'm on a Swiss cloud here. So let's just say BAM. And the port, in my case, I'm using port 5000. I'll tell you why. You will need to set up TLS certificates for your Docker API, okay? The reason for this is because we only support secured infrastructure services in Nuvla.io. And if you check the official documentation from Docker, we'll put the links in the description below, but here you can find how to protect the daemon socket for Docker and how to create the TLS certificates and all that, and then at the end, how to start your Docker daemon here with those certificates. And after this, you will have your Docker API exposed by default at this port, at this endpoint. In our case, to automate all of this process, we have actually created something that can help you, and it's optional for you, but that's what we are using here in this machine, which is what we call the Compute API. It's actually part of the Nuvla box, we'll see that later, but it's simply a container that we have deployed like this. We exposed port 5000. We could have exposed the same port as Docker 2376, but we chose 5000. and we also share a volume with that container. Okay, we do a bind mount because that container will basically relay all the incoming requests to the internal Unix socket for Docker. Okay, so it's a sort of a relay container that automates the creation of TLS certificates and the forwarding of requests to the Docker socket. Okay, and which means if we go here on this volume and we do ls opt SixSq, we will find all the different certificates that we need later on to import into Nuvla.io as a credential for this Docker infrastructure. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Here we have port 5000. Now we understand why. Let's just create. And that's it. That's very simple. But for now, what we have is simply a dummy infrastructure service because, as you can see here, we don't yet know how to get the state of this infrastructure service. What we need is, what we said before, a credential for Nuvla to be able to access it. So let's go to Credentials, click Add. So you remember these from the previous lesson. Swarm, name, let's call it imported. All right, I need a CA, so let's just do on my VM here, CA, let's copy it and paste. I need a certificate for the client, so let's go here, search, there we go, and I need the key. All right. And paste. And finally, you have this drop down here where you will select the infrastructure service that is associated with this credential. For our case, so far, we only have one, so that's the one. And just as a side note, if you have not used this NuvlaBox Compute API container to automate the setup of your Docker API TLS certificates, and you have used the official procedure here from Docker, you will find those certificates someplace else. Those three certificates, the CA, the client, and the key, are the ones that you create through these OpenSSL commands here, okay? In the end, it's the same thing. You just find them, dump them, copy and paste them into Nuvla.io, okay? And that's pretty much it. So let's just create this. And now we have a credential, okay? So what happens now, if we go back to infrastructures, is that our power button has become green. This means that Nuvla.io, with that credential, has now been able to reach out to this Docker machine here on the right side, to this Docker Swarm cluster, and tell, well, it's online, I can reach out to it, and plus, Docker Swarm is enabled here. Okay, this infrastructure has Docker Swarm. It doesn't need to have it, okay? It could just have Docker, and therefore we could use Docker Compose from Nuvla to deploy applications, but they're Swarm, and we can confirm these on the right side, Docker info, and you'll see here, Swarm is active, okay? So Nuvla.io has been able to reach out and categorize this infrastructure. So we have imported successfully a Docker Swarm infrastructure. Now, let's do the same thing for Kubernetes, okay? Here, you can see I only have this Compute API container for the Docker API TLS certificates running. Let's say I have also a Kubernetes cluster. And here, I'll be using kubeadmin just because it's much faster to just set up everything, okay? And on the left side, while the setup happens, let's go here back to infrastructures, click Add, and this time let's choose a Kubernetes infrastructure. Okay, so same thing. Let's say imported Kubernetes. My imported Kubernetes Infrastructure Service during SixSq Classroom. Right? Same thing as before, we just need to fill in the top 4. The bottom one is for the next lesson. So again, we also need an endpoint for Nuvla.io to reach out to the cluster API of my Kubernetes setup. Okay, so on the right side here, let's just finish the setup of my Kubernetes cluster. All good. And if we do kubectl config view, you will see that there are certificates for client authentication to the cluster that have been set up by kubeadmin. Okay, those are the ones that I need now to create my credential for Kubernetes. Okay, the IP is the same, and you can see it here. So that's my endpoint now. Let's copy there and paste it here. Okay, so I can create it, but again, I will have this unknown power button because again, I need a credential for Nuvla to reach out to this Kubernetes cluster. So let's go to credentials here. Let's create a new one, add, select Kubernetes on top, and same procedure, credential for my Kubernetes cluster. All right, and TLS credential for my Kubernetes cluster created during SixSq Classroom. Same thing all over. We need a certificate for the CA. And here, data has been omitted, but we do know where to find it. Here, okay? So let's just cat, there you go. And here we have a dump of the plain certificates. So let's go on top and just copy here this guy, which you will note is base64 encoded. So let's just first here do a echo and decode it. All right, that's our CA certificate. Copy and paste. Same thing now for the client certificate. So echo and for and copy and paste. Finally, the key, the client key. Once more, decode and get the key. And now, from the drop-down, we don't have a default option because now we have 2 infrastructures. So we must select the one that is adequate and respective to this credential. And in our case, it's the imported Kubernetes. And create. So now you can see up here the 2 credentials that we have just created, one for Kubernetes and the other one for the Docker Swarm infrastructure. And even though you guys can understand that underneath we actually are working with a single VM, with a single physical resource, because we have 2 different orchestration engines running inside this VM, the Kubernetes and the Docker Swarm, for Nuvla.io, those are 2 different infrastructure services because those mean that we can deploy, we have 2 different workflows for the application management. We can deploy 2 types of applications, Kubernetes applications and Docker applications, right? So that's why we have 2 infrastructures and therefore 2 credentials here. So if we go to infrastructures, you can see, as you expected, both of them are online. And in a future lesson, we will also see that we can now, from this moment, using those credentials, go to the App Store, choose an app, for example, and we will finally see here the list of infrastructures where we can deploy this app into, okay? And connectivity is all good. So We will do this on a future lesson. So for the next lesson, we will do this same procedure for creating infrastructures, but we will do them by requesting Nuvla.io to actually create the infrastructures, both Swarm and Kubernetes, from scratch in a public cloud provider of your choice. Okay? So until then, enjoy Nuvla.io and stay tuned. Cheers!